You are now listening to the Vegan Stuff Podcast with Kavakushi.
Hosting this podcast today are our two AI hosts, Sam and Kim. If you simply can't get enough of us, go to kavakushi.com and sign up for our vegan newsletter and get our free 7-day high-protein vegan meal plan. And we also have some good news. We will be releasing our first ever cookbook pretty soon, so stay tuned. Hey, don't forget to follow us on our socials too.
So I want you to imagine, just for a second, driving a massive industrial bulldozer right through the heart of the Amazon rainforest.
Right, like just completely uprooting century-old mahogany trees, crushing all the delicate undergrowth, the vines, everything.
Exactly. You're just indiscriminately killing monkeys and jaguars and macaws along the way. And you were doing all of this planetary sabotage just to catch, like, 3 wild turkeys.
Which is insane. I mean, if you saw that happening on land, you would think it was sheer madness.
Oh, absolutely. It would be the biggest environmental scandal on Earth. But the thing is, right now, completely out of sight, beneath the calm, flat blue surface of the ocean, that exact level of indiscriminate destruction is happening every single minute.
Yeah, you just can't see it from the beach.
You really can't. And that brings us to what we're talking about today. Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we are grabbing our metaphorical scuba gear to examine the massive, turbulent, and honestly intensely murky wake left by the 2021 Netflix documentary Seaspiracy.
And we really need to emphasize the sheer volume of the wake this film generated. Because it didn't just make a splash, it created a cultural tsunami.
It really did.
And to understand exactly how and why this happened, we have assembled an absolute mountain of source material for you today.
A literal mountain.
Yeah, we are looking at rigorous scientific fact checks published by the BBC, the University of Washington, and the journal Nature, Ecology, and Evolution.
But we also have the other side of it, too. We have these passionate, highly charged statements released by animal rights advocacy groups, right?
Oh.
Like PETA and Veganuary.
Exactly. Alongside leaked internal strategy documents from seafood industry trade groups who are just scrambling to manage the fallout.
Right, which means our mission today is complex, to say the least. We are going to navigate through this massive cultural wave to separate the hard facts from the sensationalized claims.
Because there were plenty of both.
Plenty of both. We want to explore the intense backlash the film faced and figure out exactly why this single 90-minute documentary so bitterly divided marine scientists, animal rights activists, and the global fishing industry.
But before we go a single step further, we need to make something explicitly clear to you, the listener.
Yes, very important.
The sources we are working from today contain highly charged, deeply polarized viewpoints. I mean, you have perspectives ranging from strict vegan advocacy on one side to vigorous seafood industry defense on the other.
With, like, incredibly frustrated marine scientists caught somewhere in the middle.
Right in the crossfire. So it is absolutely crucial to state that we are not taking a side here.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing any specific diet. We aren't validating the economic claims of the seafood industry, and we aren't rubber stamping the activist viewpoints either.
Our job is strictly analytical. We are here to unpack the fascinating, complex arguments presented in this source material. We just want to look at the mechanics of this massive cultural conversation so you can understand how these competing narratives are actually constructed.
Exactly. We are dissecting the anatomy of a viral documentary. So let's just start with the hook. How did Seaspiracy actually tell its story?
Because if you fired up Netflix expecting, a soothing David Attenborough voiceover explaining the migratory patterns of the blue whale.
You were in for a massive shock.
A huge shock.
You certainly were.
Yeah.
So the film is directed by Ali Tabrisi. He's a 27-year-old British filmmaker. And the very first thing we need to analyze is the specific psychological framing device he employs right out of the gate.
Because he doesn't introduce himself as, like, a hardened investigative journalist.
Yeah, right.
Or an expert marine biologist.
No, not at all. He introduces himself simply as an ocean lover. He tells you about growing up obsessed with dolphins and whales, being inspired by the classic documentaries of Jacques Cousteau and Sylvia Earle. He actively builds this expectation of reverence for the ocean.
Right. He sets you up for a celebration of marine biodiversity. But then, almost instantly, the journey pivots.
A hard pivot.
Yeah, what begins as a love letter to the ocean just morphs into this dark, sprawling investigation into global corruption. And the geographic scope is massive. Tabrizi and his crew travel from the Taiji dolphin drive hunts in southern Japan to the controversial whaling practices in the Faroe Islands.
And it doesn't stop there. They sneak into Thai fish markets, they film off the coast of West Africa, and they even dive into salmon aquaculture pens in Scotland.
And it's the way they film these locations that makes the documentary so potent, I think.
Oh, absolutely. The framing relies heavily on hidden cameras, intense interpersonal confrontations, and just classic gotcha journalism tactics.
Yeah, like when he sits down with representatives of major marine organizations, it's not a polite exchange of ideas.
It's an interrogation.
It really is. Furthermore, the film uses these dramatic animated sequences depicting graphic violence against marine life. It basically frames the global commercial fishing industry not as a vital food provider, but as a ruthless criminal enterprise that is essentially poaching wildlife on an unimaginable scale.
And they drop a statistic early on to back that up, claiming the industry catches up to 2.7 trillion fish a year.
Which is just a staggering number.
It is. If you break that math down, it equates to 5 million fish killed every single minute of every single day.
That number is physically difficult to comprehend, 5 million a minute. But going back to the style of the film, it's like going in expecting Planet Earth and suddenly finding yourself in an ocean-based Jason Bourne movie.
Yeah, that's exactly what it feels like.
There's this persistent sense of paranoia. But it makes you ask, does this thriller-style format inherently force the filmmaker to rely on shock and awe rather than, nuanced science?
Well, think about it. If you are structuring a narrative as a thriller, you absolutely need a clear villain. And you need a ticking clock. Nuance, caveats, complex regulatory frameworks, those don't usually make for good suspense.
They really don't. You can't put a 50-page marine policy report in a fast-paced montage.
Exactly. And you've hit on the exact psychological mechanism that makes the film work so well, and the exact reason scientists absolutely hated it.
Yeah.
By structuring the film so that Tabrizi acts as both the narrator and the protagonist, the audience is placed squarely in his shoes. It's this journey of simultaneous discovery. You, the viewer, are discovering these alleged conspiracies at the exact same moment he does.
So when he feels shocked, the editing ensures you feel shocked.
Yes, and when he feels threatened by a security guard at a port, your heart rate goes up too. This creates a powerful narrative momentum that essentially bypasses the analytical, skeptical part of your brain and speaks directly to human emotion and your intrinsic sense of justice.
It's an incredibly effective way to keep someone glued to the screen.
It is. But as environmental journalism outlets like Hakai Magazine argued in their reviews, by forcing this massive, multifaceted global issue into a neat Hollywood thriller mold, the film necessarily glossed over the deep nuance that scientists have been researching for decades.
Right.
However, we have to look at the results. I mean, the film was consistently in the top 10 most watched on Netflix globally.
It was everywhere.
It was. A reviewer in Thrillist pointed out that the issue of global overfishing was historically invisible to the public. So if this shock and awe thriller tactic is what it takes to finally get a mainstream audience to care about marine policy,
then from a pure communication standpoint, it was a masterpiece.
Except, yeah.
Okay, so Tabrizi builds this high-stakes thriller, and as we noted, a thriller needs a ticking clock. This brings us to the biggest, most explosive statistic dropped in the entire film. Tabrizi claims that if current fishing trends continue, the oceans will be virtually empty by the year 2048.
Yeah, the 2048 claim.
When you hear that, it creates a visceral reaction. Empty oceans in less than 30 years. It's a terrifying deadline. But where exactly did this doomsday clock come from? And how does it hold up mechanically under scientific scrutiny?
Well, the origin of that specific 2048 claim is actually a legitimate 2006 study published in the highly prestigious journal Science.
Okay, so it's from a real journal.
Oh, yeah. The research team was led by a marine ecologist named Dr. Boris Worm. In this paper, the scientists looked at historical data of fisheries that had already collapsed.
And just to clarify, a fishery is considered collapsed when it happens.
It's when the catch drops below 10% of its historic maximum. So in the final paragraphs of the paper, they built a mathematical model to extrapolate that data forward.
All right.
They essentially stated that if the specific downward trend they were observing continued at the exact same rate, we would see a global collapse of all currently fished taxa by the mid-21st century, landing precisely on the year 2048.
Let me stop you right there, because the concept of extrapolates data is where so many scientific claims go completely off the rails in the media.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like, okay, look at a stock market crash where the market drops 5% every day for a week.
Right.
And then extrapolating that the entire global economy will be worth $0 in 20 days. It's mathematically possible based purely on that week's trend, but it completely ignores the mechanism of human intervention.
Completely ignores it.
Right. It ignores the fact that when things get bad, governments panic, central banks intervene, people change their behavior. Did this 2006 study make that same kind of mechanical assumption about fishing?
That is a phenomenal analogy, and it perfectly describes the flaw in the 2048 projection. Extrapolation models assume a static environment. They assume the rules of the game will not change.
But they do.
But in fisheries management, the rules absolutely do change. When a fish stock plummets, regulatory bodies typically step in. They slash quotas, they mandate different gear, or they just close the fishing grounds entirely to allow the species to recover.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
You don't just keep fishing a dead zone.
Exactly. And this brings us to the intense scientific backlash the film faced when it broadcast this claim to millions of Netflix viewers in 2021. The BBC conducted a rigorous fact check on the 2048 statistic, and they went straight to the source. They interviewed Dr. Boris Worm himself.
And what did the author of the Doomsday Prediction have to say 15 years later?
His response was incredibly revealing. He explicitly pointed out that the 2006 paper was old, and the data it was based on was functionally 2 decades out of date.
Wow.
He explained that since that paper was published, there have been massive systemic efforts in many regions around the world to rebuild depleted fish populations. The static environment their model assumed did not remain static. Governments did intervene.
Wait, so the lead author of the study himself is actively walking back the apocalyptic prediction on the record?
He is. And it wasn't just in response to the film, by the way. Back in 2009, just 3 years after the initial controversial paper, Dr. Worm collaborated with a much larger group of international scientists to build out a vastly more extensive data set.
Okay, so he updated his own work.
Yes, and that 2009 follow-up paper showed a clear paradigm shift. It demonstrated that, on average, there was no longer a downward trend for global fisheries.
So the extrapolation was broken.
Exactly. Now, to be clear, they noted that many specific stocks were still in severe decline and needed urgent protection, right? But the global linear trajectory toward an empty ocean had been broken. Other stocks were successfully recovering because fishing pressure had been actively reduced.
We also have the fact check from the University of Washington's Sustainable Fisheries Project on this. How do they measure what's actually happening in the water today as opposed to a 2006 projection?
They rely on active stock assessments, which is a really complex process. I mean, you can't just count fish in the ocean like you count sheep in a paddock.
Right, they move around.
Yeah, so scientists use mechanisms like catch per unit effort.
What's that?
Basically, if a trawler spends 10 hours fishing and catches 100 tons of cod one year, but then only catches 50 tons the next year using the exact same gear and the same amount of time, you have strong mathematical evidence that the population is shrinking.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right. So the University of Washington scientists stated that when you look at formally monitored fish populations, which represents over half of all global catch, by the way, they are generally healthy or actively increasing in abundance.
So if the author of the study says the data is outdated and his own follow-up paper proved the trend was broken, and modern marine biologists agree the oceans won't be mathematically empty in 2048, why in the world would a 2021 documentary anchor its entire narrative to this specific debunked year?
Well,
is it just too catchy of a doomsday clock to pass up?
Honestly, it comes back to the psychology of the thriller format we talked about. Human psychology is deeply motivated by deadlines, abstract warnings about, declining biodiversity that doesn't get people off the couch.
No, it's too vague.
But a concrete date, 2048, that creates an immediate, tangible sense of existential panic. As a writer for Jacobin magazine noted in the review, the film clearly made a statistical misrepresentation by using that dated study.
Did Seaspiracy ever respond to that criticism?
He did. The filmmaker actually defended the use of the 2048 figure in subsequent interviews. His defense was basically that they are filmmakers, not peer-reviewed scientists, and that despite the academic squabbling over the exact mathematical projection, the overall state of global fisheries remains in severe crisis.
I see.
He argued the film was more about highlighting the disastrous direction we are heading rather than obsessing over the exact calendar date of the destination.
Which is an incredibly controversial defense in documentary filmmaking.
Oh, highly controversial.
It's essentially saying the exact math is wrong, but the emotional vibe is right.
Yeah, that's exactly what he's saying.
But if the 2048 claim is scientifically sunk, what is the actual physical reality in the ocean right now? If the oceans aren't just magically emptying out mathematically, what is physically occupying that space?
And this is where the film makes its most brilliant and jarring pivot.
Because it forces us to look at the physical debris of the industry. We need to talk about plastic.
This is perhaps the most impactful segment of the entire documentary because it directly challenges the established environmental narrative.
Right.
For years, the environmental focus for the average, well-intentioned consumer has been heavily fixated on single-use consumer plastics. We are talking about plastic grocery bags, cotton swabs, and most famously, plastic straws.
Oh man, the straws. We all remember the turning point on this. It was that viral, agonizing video of the marine biologist pulling a plastic straw out of a sea turtle's bleeding nostril.
Yeah, a brutal video to watch.
It was awful. And that one piece of footage launched 1,000 global campaigns to ban plastic straws. Entire multinational corporations change their packaging. You go to a coffee shop now and you get a paper straw that dissolves in your mouth after 5 minutes and you feel like, you've done your part to save the turtles.
Exactly. The narrative was localized entirely onto the consumer, but Seaspiracy comes in and completely flips that table. The film presents a staggering comparison. It claims that plastic straws make up only 0.03% of ocean plastic.
1.03%, that is nothing.
It's tiny. Meanwhile, it asserts that 46% of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is made up of discarded commercial fishing nets, which are widely known as ghost nets.
I want to break down the mechanics of a ghost net really quickly because the term sounds spooky, but the reality is just mechanical and brutal.
Very brutal.
A ghost net isn't just a piece of trash floating harmlessly. It's a perpetual motion machine of death. A commercial trawler loses a massive nylon net. It floats in the water column and does exactly what it was designed to do. Right. It catches fish. The net gets full of dead fish, and the sheer weight of that rotting catch causes the net to sink to the ocean floor. Down there, bottom-dwelling scavengers eat the dead fish out of the net. Now the net is lighter, so its natural buoyancy causes it to float back up into the water column where it catches more fish, gets heavy, and sinks again.
It just keeps repeating.
Yeah, this horrific, automated cycle of killing can repeat for years, completely unmonitored.
That is precisely why the film focuses on them. George Monbiot, a prominent environmentalist interviewed in the documentary, makes a very pointed argument about this discrepancy. He says the public hears about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and they picture this swirling Texas-sized island of cotton buds, plastic bags, and soda rings.
Because that's what we've been told to picture.
Exactly. He argues that environmental groups have allowed themselves to be utterly distracted by these minor consumer items, while turning a blind eye to the commercial fishing gear that is literally engineered to trap and kill marine life.
The January, one of the animal rights advocacy groups that heavily reviewed the film, captured this perfectly with an analogy. They stated that ditching plastic straws to save the oceans is like boycotting toothpicks to save the destruction of the Amazon rainforest.
That's a great analogy.
It really is.
Yeah.
When you hear it framed that way, it makes you feel like your dissolving paper straw is just a pathetic joke.
Yeah.
But we have to apply the same rigor here that we did to the 2048 claim. Is that 46% statistic actually accurate? What do the fact checkers say about the nets?
This is where we need to dive into the physical mechanics of marine debris, because the film uses a very specific geographic location to make a global point. Fact checks by both the BBC and Forbes looked closely at the 46% claim.
And what did they find?
The figure actually originates from a highly legitimate 2018 study published in Scientific Reports by Boyan Slat's Ocean Cleanup Organization. However, the critical caveat is that the study was measuring floating marine debris by weight, and it was measuring it specifically within the Great Pacific Garbage Patch.
Okay, by weight, and specifically floating in the garbage patch. Why is that distinction so critical to understanding the real picture?
Well, we have to look at how the ocean actually moves. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch is located in an oceanic gyre.
A gyre, yeah.
A gyre is essentially a massive, slow-moving oceanic whirlpool created by the Earth's rotation and global wind patterns. It acts like a gigantic cosmic centrifuge in the middle of the Pacific.
Right.
When you look at the physics of plastic, commercial fishing gear nets, massive buoys, heavy synthetic ropes is incredibly thick and highly buoyant. Because it's so heavy and durable, it floats for a very long time without breaking apart, meaning it gets swept up by the currents and trapped in the gyre.
Oh, I see.
On the other hand, thinner consumer plastics like your grocery bags and straws don't survive the journey. They get battered by UV radiation from the sun and the mechanical churning of the waves.
So they break down.
Yes, they break down rapidly into microplastics, which lose their buoyancy and sink beneath the surface, or they wash back up on beaches long before they ever reach the center of the Pacific.
Ah, okay. So the Great Pacific Garbage Patch isn't a representative sample of all the plastic in the ocean. It is essentially a specialized floating collection of only the heaviest, most durable, most buoyant plastics, which naturally skews the data heavily toward commercial fishing gear.
Precisely. The heavy stuff floats in the middle, the light stuff breaks down and sinks. Forbes strongly criticized the film for using the garbage patch as a proxy for the entire ocean, calling the comparison highly misleading.
So what is the actual global number?
If you want to look at the global picture from the surface down to the abyssal plain, Greenpeace released a comprehensive report in 2019 estimating that fishing nets likely make up about 10% of total ocean plastic waste globally, not 46%.
Okay, now I want to push back on the critics here for a second.
Well, go for it.
Let's say it is only 10% globally. 10% of the millions of tons of plastic in the ocean is still a massive, terrifying amount of lethal ghost fishing death traps.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, 46% is a geographic misrepresentation, but the core philosophical point of the film remains entirely intact. Like, why is society placing the entire moral burden on the consumer's 0.03% straw while letting the industrial fishing fleet quietly dump the other 10% with zero accountability?
And that is exactly why this specific segment of the film resonated so deeply and went viral. It articulated a profound, growing public frustration with the concept of greenwashing.
Greenwashing, yeah.
Greenwashing is the illusion of consumer control. It's the feeling that massive multinational corporations and governments have intentionally localized environmental guilt onto the individual.
Yeah, they make you feel guilty for forgetting your reusable tote bag,
Right.
while industrial megacorporations are strip mining the ecosystem with impunity.
Exactly. Seaspiracy brilliantly harnessed that latent frustration, pulled away the curtain, and pointed the finger directly at the commercial fishing industry.
And once Tabrizi established that the commercial industry was the real villain, he didn't stop at plastic. He took aim at the very concept of sustainable seafood.
He really went after it.
He went after the blue labels that consumers desperately rely on to feel good about their choices in the grocery store. If the plastic straw segment was a wake-up call, this next segment of the film was an absolute bloodbath.
It was a direct, unapologetic assault on the credibility and integrity of the world's major marine conservation organizations. The film specifically targeted two massive entities. First, the Marine Stewardship Council, or MSC, which provides the famous blue tick you see on seafood packaging, indicating the fish was caught sustainably.
Right.
And second, it targeted the Earth Island Institute, the organization that manages the ubiquitous Dolphins safe label found on almost every can of tuna in the supermarket.
Because Tabrizi wants to know how these labels are actually enforced out in the middle of the open ocean, thousands of miles from any regulatory authority.
Which is a valid question.
It is. He asserts that the independent observers, the people who are supposed to ride on these commercial vessels and ensure they are following the rules, can be easily bribed, intimidated, or even physically threatened into silence by the crew.
Yeah, it's a dangerous job.
And this leads to what is arguably the most explosive interview in the entire documentary. He sits down with Mark Palmer, the Associate Director of the International Marine Mammal Project of the Earth Island Institute.
This was the ultimate gotcha moment of the film. On camera, Ali Tabrizi asks Palmer if they can guarantee that a can of tuna with the Dolphin safe label genuinely resulted in 0 dolphin deaths.
And what does he say?
Palmer looks at the camera and admits that no, they cannot guarantee it 100%. He acknowledges the brutal reality of the open ocean. You have observers out there, but they can be bribed, and it is impossible to know what happens on every single vessel every single day.
And Seaspiracy seizes on this admission immediately. He concludes that if they can't guarantee it, the internationally recognized seafood label is a, quote, complete fabrication designed merely to ease consumer guilt while the slaughter continues.
Yeah, he doesn't hold back.
But I have to ask about the logic here. If a certifier admits they can't guarantee a label 100% of the time because maritime law enforcement on the high seas is inherently difficult, does that really mean the entire concept of sustainable fishing is a complete lie? Or is the film holding these conservation groups to a standard of absolute perfection that doesn't exist in any human endeavor?
That is the exact defense raised by the organizations involved. The Earth Island Institute and the MSC vigorously disputed their portrayal in the film, stating their representatives' comments were cherry-picked and edited wildly out of context to make them look complicit.
Which happens in documentaries a lot.
It does. And to address your point about perfection versus progress, we need to look at the historical mechanisms of conservation. Newsweek conducted a deep fact check specifically on the Dolphin Safe label following the film's release.
What did they find?
They quoted a senior fishery scientist from the Monterey Bay Aquarium who provided vital historical context. He pointed out that in the 1980s, before these labels existed, U.S. dolphin mortality from the tuna industry was around 130,000 animals per year.
130,000 dolphins a year.
Yes. By 2018, thanks almost entirely to the consumer pressure and fleet regulations spurred by these very labeling programs, there were only 819 documented deaths.
Wait, from 130,000 down to 819? How did they physically achieve a drop that massive?
By changing the physical mechanics of the fishing process. The tuna industry used to look for dolphins on the surface because yellowfin tuna historically school underneath them.
Oh, I see.
So they would encircle the dolphins with massive purse seine nets to catch the tuna below, pulling everything up together and drowning the dolphin.
That's awful.
The labeling program forced vessels to adopt new techniques, like the back-down procedure, where they basically reverse the ship to lower a section of the net, allowing the dolphins to swim out before the tuna are hauled in. They also mandated different net designs and the presence of those observers we mentioned.
So it is an undeniable, massive success story in conservation. It reduced mortality by over 99%. A representative from the Natural Resources Defense Council brought up a great comparison for this. They noted that we have traffic laws against speeding. Those laws are good, and they save lives. But Highway Patrol can't catch every single person who speeds.
Right, you can't be everywhere.
Exactly. Just because some illegal activity slips through and someone goes 80 in a 65 zone doesn't mean the concept of a speed limit is a complete fabrication and we should just abolish the police.
That's a perfect analogy. Daniel Pauly, a highly respected fishery scientist at the University of British Columbia, wrote in Vox that the film bizarrely blames the very NGOs who are actually in the trenches trying to fix the problem, rather than focusing its ire entirely on the industrial companies causing it.
It's a misdirection of anger.
It really is. And we see this same tension when the film tackles the issue of bycatch. Bycatch is the term for when a commercial net scoops up marine life that the fishers aren't actually targeting and often aren't legally allowed to sell. This includes dolphins, sea turtles, sharks, or just the wrong species of fish. Seaspiracy claims that a staggering 40% of all marine life caught globally is thrown back overboard as bycatch, mostly dead or dying.
40% is nearly half the ocean's yield just being tossed back as garbage. How did scientists react to that number?
With immense frustration, yet again. The 40% figure is another statistic that fishery scientists push back on heavily. According to the University of Washington's Sustainable Fisheries Group, the global average for bycatch discarded at sea over the past decade is closer to 10%.
Okay, 10%, but we have to apply the same logic we did to the ghost nets.
Right.
10% of roughly 90 million tons of global fish catch is still 9 million tons of wasted dead marine life every year. Mechanically, it is a massive ecological issue. Bottom trawlers in particular have horrific bycatch rates because dragging a net across the seafloor is entirely indiscriminate.
It pulls up everything.
Yes, everything. But again, 10% is fundamentally different from the 40% claimed in the film. The scientists argued that exaggerating the data destroys the credibility needed to actually pass legislation to fix the problem.
Exactly. You can't write policy based on inflated numbers.
The film doesn't just limit its critique to the open ocean either. Seaspiracy recognizes that a lot of people think they have the solution to overfishing wild populations, which is aquaculture.
Farmed fish.
Yeah, we farm cows, pigs, and chickens on land to protect wild animals, so why not just farm fish?
Yeah.
So Seaspiracy travels to Scotland to investigate, the farmed salmon industry.
Right, and the theory of aquaculture sounds perfect on paper. You breed fish in controlled floating pens, thereby relieving the pressure on wild ocean ecosystems.
But Seaspiracy portrays aquaculture not as a solution, but as an ecological disaster of its own making.
The film dives into the mechanisms of salmon farming, highlighting severe systemic issues. First, there is the feed conversion ratio. Salmon are carnivorous predators. To feed a farmed salmon, you have to catch massive amounts of wild forage fish, like anchovies and sardines, grind them into fish meal, and feed them to the salmon.
Oh, wow.
It takes more wild fish to feed the farmed fish than the farmed fish eventually produce in meat.
So you aren't actually saving wild fish, you are just changing which wild fish you are killing.
Exactly, you're just shifting the burden. Furthermore, the film explores the severe degradation of coastal environments. When you pack hundreds of thousands of salmon into a single floating pen, all of their biological waste drops straight down onto the seafloor, creating massive dead zones devoid of oxygen.
Just a pile of toxic waste.
Yeah. And finally, the film highlights the rampant spread of disease, specifically the sea louse. In the wild, salmon swim vast distances and lice populations are naturally diluted. But in a densely packed pen, sea lice multiply exponentially, literally eating the farmed salmon alive.
That is horrifying.
And it gets worse because it eventually spreads out into the wild to infect passing wild salmon populations.
The footage they show of these salmon in the dock is genuinely sickening. The film essentially dismisses aquaculture entirely as an environmental nightmare. And again, the industry fought back. We have a statement from the Scottish Salmon Producers Organization calling the film's portrayal of their industry wrong, misleading, and inaccurate, claiming they have rigorous veterinary standards.
Of course they did.
But let's look at where the narrative has maneuvered the viewer. The film concludes that sustainable wild fishing doesn't exist because labels are fake. It concludes that aquaculture is a toxic, disease-ridden disaster. By systematically destroying every possible alternative, Tabrizi paints the viewer into a very specific corner.
He really does.
It leaves you with only one possible solution, which he delivers as his grand final conclusion. The only way to save the ocean is to stop eating fish entirely. Go completely plant-based.
And that single, uncompromising mandate is what caused a massive, fascinating rift in how the film was ultimately received. It drew a deep line in the sand between two very different groups who both cared deeply about the environment and animals, but approached the issue from entirely different paradigms.
Let's look at the first side of that divide. The animal rights advocacy groups. To say they rejoiced when this film dropped would be an understatement.
They loved it.
PETA called it not to be missed. They encouraged their members to host watch parties, and they eventually even awarded the film an OSCAT, their version of an Oscar for Best Picture. Veganuary
also praised the film heavily, and it is important to understand why they loved it so much. For these groups, their takeaway wasn't just about ecological metrics, tons of biomass, or bycatch percentages. It was fundamentally about ethics.
Yes, the moral argument.
They highlighted the film's assertion that fish are not just a crop to be harvested, they are individuals that possess complex nervous systems and feel pain and fear.
The film actually goes out of its way to humanize marine life. It discusses how fish have complex communication networks. There is a fascinating, slightly humorous segment noting that herrings actually communicate in the dark by farting.
By farting, yeah, releasing gas bubbles from their anal duct to signal the school.
It shows that they have social structures, and then it contrasts that with the sheer brutality of how they are killed. Dragging them up from the deep in massive nets causes agonizing decompression. Their swim bladders expand and rupture, their eyes bulge, and they slowly suffocate on the deck of a ship.
It's gruesome. And for the vegan and animal rights advocates, the issue isn't about population management. It's about the inherent cruelty of treating sentient, feeling beings as a disposable industrial commodity. As Veganuary summarized in their review, there is simply no moral way to decimate wildlife populations sustainably.
Right. If the process involves mass slaughter, the math of how many are left in the ocean is completely irrelevant to the ethical argument. So for that camp, the film was a total triumph because it validated their core ethical stance on a massive mainstream platform. But then you look at the other side of the divide, the marine scientists and the boots-on-the-ground environmental conservationists, and they were absolutely pulling their hair out over this film.
They were highly, highly critical. Bryce Stewart, a marine ecologist at the University of York, publicly called it the worst kind of journalism.
Ouch.
Yeah. He pointed out a glaring logical fallacy in the film's conclusion. He stated that arguing that sustainable fisheries don't exist because some fisheries are corrupt is like arguing that sustainable agriculture doesn't exist because factory farming is awful.
Oh, that's a really good point.
All human food production has a biological impact on the planet, but some methods are vastly better managed, more heavily regulated, and less destructive than others. Daniel Pauly, who we quoted earlier, said the film undermined a genuinely important message about the horrors of industrial fishing with an avalanche of falsehoods.
It's truly a fascinating paradox. A film entirely dedicated to saving the ocean somehow managed to unite animal rights activists while deeply alienating the actual marine biologists who dedicate their entire lives and careers to fighting for ocean conservation.
It's wow.
How do we reconcile that collision? We have the emotional truth of the film's message about animal cruelty crashing headfirst into the scientific inaccuracies that the experts are pointing out.
A representative from Fauna and Flora International captured this exact tension perfectly, releasing a statement noting that the film had bitterly divided the environmental community. And you can see this clearly in how Greenpeace reacted.
Greenpeace is famous for direct action.
They are. They are the ones who put small inflatable boats between harpoons and whales. Yet they had a very nuanced response to Seaspiracy. They completely agreed with the film's spotlight on the devastation of industrial overfishing, but they fundamentally rejected Tabrizi's ultimate conclusion that the only answer is for everyone on Earth to stop eating fish.
Which is interesting because Tabrizi actually confronts Greenpeace in the film for not telling people to go vegan. What is Greenpeace's alternative mechanism for saving the ocean? If not a global consumer boycott of fish, then what are they actually pushing for?
Greenpeace advocates for systemic international political change rather than relying solely on individual consumer dietary shifts. They argue that asking 8 billion people to simply change their diet is an impossible and ineffective strategy.
It's just not going to happen.
Exactly. Instead, they are pushing for a UN global ocean treaty. The goal of this treaty is to mandate the protection of at least 30% of the world's oceans by 2030, establishing massive, legally binding, no-catch marine sanctuaries.
So instead of trying to manage exactly how many fish a boat can pull out of an area, you just draw a giant red line on the map and say, no human extraction allowed here whatsoever. Allow the ecosystems to function as a nursery.
Exactly. They argue that protecting migratory pathways and biodiversity hotspots is the realistic, politically actionable path forward. They want to restrict the industry's access, rather than expecting the entire global population to spontaneously adopt a plant-based lifestyle.
I want to bring in a perspective from Charles Clover, the executive director of the Blue Marine Foundation. He is an absolute veteran in this field. He wrote the book, The End of the Line, which is widely considered a seminal text on global overfishing.
Very important book.
He was incredibly critical of the film's factual errors. For example, he pointed out how the film frames global whale strandings as being almost solely caused by ocean plastic pollution, when the biological and acoustic reality of why whales beach themselves is vastly more complex, involving military sonar and shifting magnetic fields.
Right, it's not just plastic.
But despite tearing into the errors, he actually praised the film's overall cultural impact.
He did. Clover acknowledged the fundamental truth that the problem of global overfishing is immense, remote, and highly technical. Because it happens over the horizon, out of sight, it is incredibly hard to get the general public to focus on it.
Because it's invisible to us.
Yes. He noted that prior to this film, the younger generation genuinely thought that banning plastic straws was the single most important ocean conservation issue on the planet. Seaspiracy shattered that narrative overnight.
That is true.
Clover noted that even if he found the film's stop eating fish conclusion thoroughly unsatisfactory and simplistic, he deeply appreciated that Tabrizi used his platform to finally get millions of people to pay attention to industrial fleet quotas, bycatch, and marine protected areas.
So we have the scientists and the activists locked in this intense debate over data extrapolation, the physics of ocean gyres, and the ethics of animal sentience. But the pushback to this film didn't just come from academia and NGOs. The seafood industry itself mobilized a massive coordinated defense.
Oh, they definitely did.
And in doing so, they highlighted a crucial, undeniable human element that Seaspiracy largely glossed over.
They absolutely did. And it is fascinating to look at the mechanics of how the industry prepared for this PR nightmare. We have access to leaked internal documents from the National Fisheries Institute, which is a major U.S. seafood trade group.
What did those docs say?
These documents revealed their strategy before the film even premiered on Netflix. They knew it was coming. They preemptively labeled the documentary a dishonest attack and actively planned to characterize it to the mainstream media not as an environmental documentary, but as a vegan indoctrination movie.
Wow. They were drawing battle lines before the opening credits rolled. They wanted to attack the filmmakers' ideological motives to discredit the data. And when the film finally dropped, the Global Aquaculture Alliance came out swinging with massive economic numbers. They released a statement declaring that the film's mandate to abandon all fisheries and aquaculture would not only rob billions of people of a healthful protein source, but it would actively destroy the livelihoods of approximately 250 million people employed globally by the industry.
250 million jobs. And this brings us to what is arguably the most poignant and devastating critique of the film, which focuses heavily on socioeconomics, privilege, and the reality of global food systems.
Let's get into it.
Dihya Belhabib, a highly respected marine scientist, wrote a critical review in the journal Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. She argued that the film's central, uncompromising mandate to simply stop eating fish is deeply embedded in white privilege and colonialism.
That is an incredibly heavy critique. Let's unpack the mechanics of that.
Yeah.
How exactly does asking people to adopt a plant-based diet to save the ocean equate to privilege and colonialism?
Well, Belhabib points out that the film views the world through a highly Western, industrialized lens. It ignores a fundamental statistical reality. More than 90% of the global fishing effort is not conducted by massive steel factory trawlers. It is small-scale, artisanal, and coastal in nature.
Okay, so it's not all mega corporations.
Far from it. For billions of people, particularly in the global south and in developing island nations, seafood is not a luxury item you choose from a menu at a high-end restaurant. It is an absolute daily necessity for sheer survival and nutritional security.
Right, it's a completely different paradigm. We are not talking about someone in London or Los Angeles standing in a Whole Foods agonizing over whether to buy the wild-caught salmon fillet or the new soy-based Beyond Burger. We're talking about communities that have no alternatives.
Exactly. Let's look at the mechanisms of survival for coastal communities in places like Senegal, which are briefly, almost passingly, shown in the film. In many of these regions, you have arid coastlines with a severe lack of arable land.
They can't just grow crops.
No, they cannot simply transition to farming. The soil and climate won't support it. Furthermore, they are trapped in cycles of intergenerational poverty. They rely on small wooden boats and hand nets to catch enough fish to feed their families that day.
Wow.
To make matters worse, massive foreign industrial trawlers, often subsidized by wealthy nations, are sweeping into their waters and wiping out their only accessible food source, forcing them closer to starvation.
Which is the real tragedy here.
It is. For these populations, stopping seafood consumption isn't a simple dietary swap or a moral awakening. It is a direct threat to their survival, their local economy, and their deeply ingrained cultural heritage. The New Economics Foundation echoed this sentiment powerfully, criticizing the film for presenting a classic white savior narrative where Western filmmakers swoop in to tell developing nations how to live without understanding the local economic mechanisms.
Because if we all just stopped eating fish tomorrow, what actually happens to the coastal communities in developing nations who don't have a supermarket full of plant-based alternatives and vitamin supplements? The film frames the ocean as this pristine, untouched wilderness that should be entirely separate from humanity.
But that's just not reality.
No, it fails to recognize that humans are, and have always been, an apex predator within the global ecosystem. There is a profound tension here. You have this incredibly difficult collision of ethics. The undisputed moral argument against the industrial slaughter of sentient animals crashing headfirst into the brutal socioeconomic reality of human survival in the global south.
It perfectly highlights a Western-centric viewpoint where nature is viewed as something out there to be preserved behind a glass case, rather than a dynamic living environment that humans have interacted with for sustenance for millennia.
Right.
In fact, Christina Hicks, an academic who actually appeared in the documentary, felt so misrepresented by the final product that she publicly distanced herself from it on social media.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she stated clearly that while there are severe, undeniable issues with corruption and over-extraction in the industrial fishing sector, fish remain absolutely critical to food and nutrition security in vulnerable, impoverished geographies worldwide. You cannot solve an ecological crisis by initiating a humanitarian one.
Wow. So what does this all mean? We've looked at the thriller tactics and the hidden cameras. We've unpacked the mechanisms of the outdated 2048 doomsday claim. We've explored the physics of ocean gyres and the debate over plastic straws versus heavy ghost nets.
You covered a lot of ground.
We've examined the brutal realities of high seas enforcement and the attack on sustainable labels. We've seen the sheer joy from animal rights groups validating the sentience of marine life, the deep groans from marine scientists begging for nuance, and the outrage from advocates for the global south who see the film's conclusion as a privileged fantasy.
Yeah.
If we pull all these disparate, wildly conflicting threads together, where does that leave Seaspiracy as a piece of media?
It leaves it as a deeply flawed, mathematically loose, yet profoundly effective piece of global communication.
Yeah.
Did the film play fast and loose with some data? Yes. Did it alienate the very fishery scientists who are in the trenches fighting to save the oceans? Yes. Did it largely ignore the complex life or death realities of global food security for the world's poorest people? Absolutely.
But did it achieve its primary goal? Did it take the invisible, remote, highly technical issue of global overfishing, an issue buried in complex quota spreadsheets and maritime law, and force it into the mainstream conversation?
Yes, it undeniably did.
It made the entire world look beneath that calm, flat blue surface we talked about at the beginning of the show. As that reviewer and Thrillist noted, the shock and awe was highly effective. People who'd never once thought about a ghost net or bycatch or the feed conversion ratio of farmed Scottish salmon in their entire lives were suddenly debating international marine policy at the dinner table.
Which brings up a fascinating, slightly unsettling paradox of environmental communication for us to consider. Do we need sensationalism, dramatic music, hidden cameras, and slight statistical exaggerations to make the general public care about an invisible, slow-moving ecological crisis?
That's the million-dollar question.
Or does relying on those tactics ultimately damage the long-term credibility of the environmental movement when the facts are inevitably checked and debunked? If a documentary can so easily sway global public opinion and consumer behavior while omitting the lives and livelihoods of millions of small-scale fishers in the developing world, what other massive global narratives are we passively accepting without demanding to see the whole picture?
That is the perfect provocative question to leave you with today. The next time you look out at a calm ocean, or the next time you fire up a slickly produced documentary on Netflix, remember that the smooth surface rarely tells the whole story. The mechanics underneath are always chaotic, always complex, and usually full of competing interests. Keep questioning what you watch, look for the nuance hidden in the murky waters, and never stop diving deeper. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening. We hope you liked this episode. If you did, we'd really appreciate it if you could give us 5 stars on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. Also, we would be so appreciative if you could just share this episode or this podcast with all your friends and family who are vegans or vegan friendly. We're also really excited because we are going to be launching something really cool pretty soon on the site, so keep an eye out for that. And we will see you really soon with a new episode.